as I said before, any proceedings in the EPO, but primarily a pre-grant procedure. They are written observations on patentability that absolutely anybody can file in relation to a pending European application. They can be about anything. Any ground of patentability, put new prior art in, file evidence. You can put whatever you want in third-party observations. They can be completely anonymous, or they can identify who the observer is. But very different to opposition proceedings, you are not a party to anything. You file the observations, they go to the EPO decides how much weight they want to play to them, they decide if they want to listen to them. You have absolutely no comeback if the EPO decide to ignore them completely. So some pros and cons to third-party observations. They can be completely anonymous. They're inexpensive, there's no fee because there's no subsequent procedure to deal with, there's no hearings to go to, so costs are very low. They can be particularly effective if you can file them early in proceedings, so before the examiner has really examined the case. If you've got some really good prior art, a novelty attack or some really close prior art, and you get them on record early in proceedings and you get them framed in a way that the EP examiner understands. So you use European law, you explain why the prior art is relevant in an EPO manner, you make it easy for the examiner to see why these third-party observations are relevant, and you get them on file early, they can be a really good weapon. But you have to use them correctly. The cons are there's no follow-up to third-party observations. If the examiner ignores them, the examiner ignores them. You have no right to be heard and follow up on your arguments. If you file your third-party observations, they don't work, you don't knock out the patent, you then decide to oppose. You have given the patentee pre-warning of what your attacks might be. There is no strict estoppel between third-party observations and opposition, but examiners are people. You know, in their mind, they've seen these documents and arguments, they haven't been considered relevant. You've potentially got a slight uphill battle to change their mind in opposition. And they're less effective if you're filing third-party observations later on in the proceedings. Again, examiners are people. If they pretty much have decided that this case is allowable, you know, it's a lot of work for them to change their mind. Or if perhaps the issues that you're presenting in the third-party observations are really finely balanced issues of sufficiency, perhaps that's not a great circumstance to file third-party observations, because perhaps at a late stage, or if these things are finely balanced, the examiners are going to think, you know, this is pre-grant. These people have the right to oppose. Opposition is the proper forum to be discussing these issues. I'm going to grant the case, let them oppose. So that's just a quick summary of how you can file third-party observations. Really easy. There's a form on the EPO website. Straightforward. And then just to summarize the differences that I've talked about, they're both really valuable options to you. I think that, you know, the big benefit to companies about third-party observations is the fact that they're inexpensive. You can potentially stop a patent even being granted. You can completely avoid the need for opposition proceedings. But they have to be used in the right and correct way, because if you use them too late, they're not framed properly, or you're raising arguments that really aren't appropriate, you possibly weaken your position for a later opposition. Okay, and the final procedure I wanted to talk about really quickly is central limitation at the EPO. So this is a provision that came in with the EPC 2000 law, so came into force about 2007. Prior to that, if you wanted to amend your claims post-grant, you had to do it nationally, individually, separately through each of the patent offices across Europe, all of whom had slightly different provisions. Some didn't even allow you to make post-grant amendments. Now you can, through a single procedure at the EPO, amend your claims post-grant, and that amendment has to be observed by all of the national offices. It can be done any time after grant, provided there aren't opposition proceedings pending. You don't have to provide any reason, any substantive reason to the EPO about your limitation, and there are just some limited examination carried out on formal requirements. So is the amendment you're making really a limitation to the scope? Is it clear? And does it comply with the added matter provisions? So why might you be thinking about doing this? So the common reason would be perhaps your EPO application got through to grant quite quickly. 2 years after it grants, examination in China kicks up. The Chinese Patent Office find a piece of prior art that you never knew about before, and it's a bit of a novelty problem for your broadest claims. You're thinking, this is quite an important case, I might potentially want to enforce it at some point. You know, what I want to enforce, I still get with my narrower claims, but you know, if I keep claim one as it is, that's a heap of problems I've got to deal with in litigation proceedings. So let me just get my patent in shape before I take it further. Let me get rid of that claim that's now a bit dodgy and go to my narrower claim, and then I'll think about enforcing it. So that's really the circumstance when you might be thinking about this. It's a pretty straightforward procedure. Central application at the EPO, they examine it, it goes through quite quickly. You in essence have a re-grant procedure, much like the normal EPO grant procedures. Some national revalidation formalities, so there's a bit of admin to do, but not too onerous. And I think it's not seen very often, but there's a real place for it if you, in the pharma industry particularly, or any industry where you can avoid, at least, you know, in the UK courts, having to deal with applications to amend through the UK courts as part of your infringement proceedings. Far better to get it cleaned up before you even think about that. So that's my whistle-stop tour of some options you have in the EPO. I think I've just about stayed to time, so thank you all for listening.
You need to be adversely affected in order to appeal from the
Yes.
EPU. I thought the way is if two parties are doing, if one of them loses, is adversely affected, or is it a much higher standard when you say need to be adversely affected in order to appeal?
Yeah, so it's you do need to be adversely affected to appeal. It's not a standard that is looked at very strictly. So, for example, if you're a patentee and you've been subject to opposition proceedings and you've had to amend your patent from what was granted in any way, you still have a patent, but you've had to amend it, you're adversely affected because your main request would have been to not touch my patent. There are situations where you may be a party to opposition proceedings and you're not adversely affected. So if the patent comes out of opposition proceedings completely untouched, the patentee is not adversely affected because he's got exactly what he wants. But the opponent is adversely affected because he didn't get what he wants. So the opponent can appeal. The patentee can't appeal that decision, but the patentee will still be a party to the appeal proceedings. So that's how it works. In all instances, both parties will be parties to the appeal proceedings. Just sometimes they will both be appellants, sometimes only one will be appellant, and the other is a non-appellant party. Okay?
Yeah, I have a question. Yeah, I have a question here. Excuse me. Yeah, you mentioned in the added subject matter under Article 123 EPC.
Yes.
Like you had a strict test of novelty.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in that you mentioned as omission of feature. Omission of feature, like.
How do I go back?
Side. Yeah. In that, how does this omission of feature contribute to this strict test of novelty?
Let me just find the slide. Yeah. So, so your question is, how does omission of a feature?
Yeah.
Let me just slideshow. There we go.
Yeah.
So, are we asking about the omission of a feature?
Yeah, omission of feature. Yeah.
Okay, so one of the types of amendment that the EPO might consider to added matter is perhaps, let's say the invention was a process and you have 4 steps in that process, and the final step is a purification step, and throughout the entire patent the process is only ever described concluding in the purification step. If you then try to amend a claim to claim the process without the purification step, the EPO would consider that claim to add matter. Not all added matter tests apply exactly as to the novelty circumstance. There are some where the novelty test doesn't really apply, but I think that the point of the novelty test there is that the EPO looks on novelty very strictly, and they apply the same strictness to the added matter provisions. I hope that answers your question.
Maybe next year we will complete human and so many questions on that, especially with respect to the EPO.
Yes.
And I know there are many questions that people would like to ask on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anyone does have any questions, they can
have more questions,
approach after.